Hello and welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. We continue our study in the book of Acts of the New Testament and take up the storyline in the middle of Paul defending his teachings and the gospel story as he is presented. Recall he was seized by the Jews at Herod's temple in Jerusalem, that is the second temple, while in his cleaning ritual sequester period prior to the holy days of Pentecost, which was a requirement for him to have to do in that day and time to enter the temple after having been gone for some time. The Jews there became a mob and intended to kill him, which they saw as their religious duty, charging him with defiling the temple. But he was rescued and arrested by the Roman cohort present nearby. Once in the cohort's security and being led away into to their guard platform that was right there near the temple, practically in the temple yard, he asked the commander for permission to speak to this mob, for which permission was granted. And we take up that story at the end of his addressing them, having covered the body of that speech last time in lesson 54. So today's a fairly long read. Starts in chapter 22 of Acts, verse 22, and reads through the end of chapter 23. Up to this point, they listened to him, and then they shouted, "Away with such a fellow from this earth! For he should not be allowed to live." And while they were shouting, throwing off their cloaks, and tossing dust into the air, the tribune directed that he was to be brought into the barracks, and ordered him to be examined by flogging, to find out the reason for this outcry against him. But when they had tied him up with thongs, but said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it legal," that is, Paul said this, "is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who is uncondemned?" When the centurion heard that, he went to the tribune and said to him, "What are you about to do? This man's a Roman citizen." The tribune came and asked Paul, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" And he said, "Yes." The tribune answered, "It cost me a large sum of money to get my citizenship." Paul said, "But I was born a citizen." Immediately, those who were about to examine him drew back from him, and the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and he had bound him. Since he wanted to find out what Paul was being accused of by the Jews, the next day he released him and ordered the chief priest and the entire council to meet. He brought Paul down and laid him and had him stand before them. While Paul was looking intently at the council, he said, "Brothers, up to this day I have lived my life with a clear conscience before God." Then the high priest, Ananias, ordered those standing near him to strike him in the mouth. At this Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting there to judge me according to the law, and yet in violation of the law you ordered me to be struck?" Those standing nearby said, "Do you dare to insult God's high priests?" And Paul said, "I did not realize, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of the leader of your people." When Paul noticed that some were Sadducees and others were Pharisees, he called out in the council, "Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of a Pharisee. I am on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead." When he said this, a dissension began between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, or angels, or spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge all three of these. Then a great clamor arose, and certain scribes of the Pharisees group stood up and contended, "We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" When the dissension became violent, the tribune, fearing that they would tear Paul to pieces, ordered the soldiers to go down, take him by force, and bring him into the barracks. That night the Lord stood near him, and said, "Keep up your courage, for just as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must bear witness also in Rome." In the morning the Jews joined in a conspiracy and bound themselves by an oath, neither to eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who joined in the conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and your council must notify the tribune to bring him down to you, on the pretext that you want to make a more thorough examination of his case, and we are ready to do away with him before he arrives." Now the son of Paul's sister heard about the ambush, so he went and gained entrance to the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to report to him." So he took him, brought him to the tribune, and said, "The prisoner Paul called me and asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to tell you." The tribune took him by the hand, drew him aside privately, and asked, "What is it that you have to report to me?" He answered, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, and though they were going to inquire more thoroughly into this case. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him. They have bound themselves by an oath, neither to eat nor drink until they kill him. They are ready now and are waiting for your consent." So the tribune dismissed the young man, ordering him, "Tell no one that you have informed me of this." Then he summoned 2 of the centurions and said, "Get ready to leave by 9 o'clock tonight for Caesarea, with 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. Also provide mounts for Paul to ride, and take him safely to Felix, the governor." He wrote a letter to this effect. Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency, the governor Felix, greeting. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. But when I had learned that he was a Roman citizen, I came with the guards and rescued him. Since I wanted to know the charge to which they accused him, I had him brought to their council. I found that he was accused concerning questions of their law, but was charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. When I was informed that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him. So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him during the night to Antipatus. The next day they let the horsemen go on with him, while they returned to the barracks. When they came to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province we belonged to, and when he learned that I was from Caesarea, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. Then he ordered that he be kept under guard in Herod's headquarters. The scholars say this generally, reads straight through. The narrative is very well written there. So they tend to spend their time focusing on certain parts of it. Scholars vary a good bit as to what they focus on. Dr. Matthew Skinner from the Luther Seminary in Minnesota, in his a very recent commentary written within months of me giving this to you, on his commentary section starts off with this idea. Paul believes this mob crowd understands that is Paul's previous actions were out of the same zeal for God and God's way that this Jewish mob believes that they are responding. In other words, that both of them believe they're being led by God, and consequently, Paul believes if he talks to them, he can reason with them, get them to understand that. But likely, when he said in this zeal, this violent acts towards the way, be directed and was founded on ignorance, that their objections to the way was based on ignorance, they stopped listening, is the way Dr. Skinner sort of starts this off. Did Luke leave the assumption here, he says, that those Jews who do not follow Jesus are somehow inherently violent in their reaction towards Jews who do follow Jesus? Others add in that sort of in this vein, this area, or is there an underlying statement here? Are they all ignorant of what they should do? Skinner notes, but Paul is not referring to Judaism in an abstract manner here. He's very specific, according to the way Luke writes this. He stuck to his own story and his encounter with God through Jesus Christ in this previous defense here that we covered last time. And he tells it in a way to address this defense to them, not in a style to try to convert them. In other words, Paul is trying to defend himself. He is not in the preaching mode here. Instead, they take, of course, the Jews here take deep offense as to what has been said. Likely Paul had more to communicate to them, but the Roman authorities act to prevent a major event here this close to Pentecost. We have to appreciate, scholars say, this is one of the highest holy days. Weather had cleared enough at this time. It was one of the most high events. Largest crowds tended to be there for Pentecost, because people could travel from a lot of other areas to get there for that day. That may have been shut off back in the days of unleavened bread, 50 days before. The Romans are in control here at this point in time, is a point that several scholars say we should not miss. That Rome is in control. The Jews have a certain level of control, but they do not have the ultimate control here. Some scholars note, including Dr. Skinner, that a possible reason for this strong reaction at this point relates to a general interpretation of Isaiah chapter 6, verses 9 through 10. That idea is that God has hardened the heart of the Jew. Maybe they see Paul here as thinking he is like Isaiah. He is reminding these people that they have a hardened heart. And that prophecy is debated a lot in Judaism in this period of time. That this idea that they have been preached at, that you Jews have a hardened heart. You cannot be changed, and you will not change. Paul will actually say that, but not, he hasn't said that yet in Luke, but before we finish the book of Acts, we will actually see Paul make that statement to them. Dr. Skinner and other scholars warn students to be sure to remember the argument here is in Acts, at that time of their happening, is intra-Jewish. That is, the argument within Christianity, or the way as it's referred to here, and within Judaism. All this is going on within Judaism. Christianity is not a separate sect. It's not operating a sect. They're not even trying to be a separate sect at this point, says Dr. Skinner. That will change later in the evolution history of the Christian movement. But it's not at this time. Judaism at this point still has lots of various sects operating. One of those sects being what's referred to here as the Way, or what we refer to as Christianity. This is not a clash between two separate religions at this point in time. Paul does not see his calling to follow Jesus Christ as something separate from Judaism's identity. We see that Paul is coming back here to the High Holy Days, participating in the classic Jewish rituals and bringing his alms and so forth. He was here at this time and place to follow his obedience to Judaism and God. Although this season of Pentecost now takes on an extra special thing for the people who are in this way, or the Christians. In other words, it has added meaning now, over and above the meaning it has in Judaism, which was quite a significant day in Judaism as far as what it was all about. This was not just a harvest celebration. It had theological significance as well. Remember, he intended to be there for all the spring holy days, that is Paul, but had been interrupted. Couldn't get there in time for Passover because they learned about this plot while he was up there in Asia and Southern Europe, getting ready to head back, and then he changed his route, went back through Asia, which prohibited him from getting to Jerusalem in time for the first part of the spring holiday season. Dr. Robert Wall at Seattle Pacific University notes that Luke and other writers of this that are writing about this time say that writers who write in this period of time, be they Roman, be they Greek, be they Jews, use a lot of interpretation of speech as a literary technique to note some very important points. And so that's one of the things the literary scholars point out here. This whole thing of this series of speeches that Paul's giving, he's trying to make some points. The author's trying to make points. It's not just a charismatic thing, but they're significant, almost climactic type points. And after all, we're real close to the end of this book. In this case, the Jews in Jerusalem interrupt Paul when he implies that Gentiles will share in Israel's salvation. Oh, what an inflammatory statement to them. It's the idea, one scholar says. He says, that is just like throwing fuel in a burning man's face. They do not intend to give him an opportunity to provide any proof to that point and shout him out. He should not live. The throwing off of their cloaks and the gestures of throwing dirt in the air in that day and time was a Jewish method, and not only them, but it was a general method that says, I am ready to do my part. In other words, I'm ready to throw the first stone. I'm ready to help carry him out of town. I am ready to help bury him when it's over. Recall earlier at Stephen's stoning, Paul, or Saul as he was called at the time, held their cloaks, meaning he was in full support. Paul was in full support of what they were doing back there at Stephen's time. Now he's facing that same medicine. The tribune, which is the commander here of this Roman cohort, is likely very confused as to why Paul said why what Paul said caused such hostile action, because he doesn't understand the theology of what was going on. He does not, as a Roman Gentile soldier, have any real clue of the significance of that statement, that the Gentiles will share in Israel's salvation. Doesn't understand why that's a triggering point. It's a key point, scholars say, that we should not miss. So he takes what is normal Roman method of obtaining the bottom line of extracting the truth, which was flogging, torture, if you will. If Paul had not revealed he was a Roman citizen, and not only that, and not a native Judean, then the tribune probably would have just allowed it to be him to go ahead and carry out their legal right, because if he'd been there from there, not a Roman citizen, then they had the legal authority to do what they were going to do. So here the tribune concludes that he cannot get to the bottom of this, since Paul is a Roman citizen, and he will have him sent to higher authorities who can obtain the truth and question the Jewish prosecutors as well. In other words, this mass is interfering, especially now that they have a vendetta that they have formed, that they're going to go after him. Thus, with the additional information, the intel, let's see us here, the tribune orders Paul to take him to headquarters, to Governor Felix, to the Roman headquarters. But not before the tribune orders an extremely large and powerful detailed force to escort Paul at night, in other words, during a highly risked event, for extra security reasons, as he's taken him directly to the governor. In that day and time, such a large force would have been able to protect Paul against a very large enemy force. As a attacking force generally would have had to be, in that day and time, 3 times the size of the defending force, if not larger. Some scholars raise serious doubt that such a large force would have left Jerusalem this close to Pentecost. So there's an awful lot of historians that just feel like there's a lot of hyperbole going on here, and suggests that the numbers that left would have been much smaller. But this idea that that he divides this force in such a fashion that he has a rapid movement force, and Paul mounted, and that's the force that then proceeds on after they go halfway with the heavy force, would have been a very wise military move. So military people say, if this did happen, this man's a very good military commander. He knows what he's doing. Dr. Eugene Boring and Dr. Fred Craddock, the late Dr. Fred Craddock, in their New Testament commentary, remind readers of the point that this crowd stopped listening to Paul's defense is highly significant here. The fact they stopped, did not listen, did not give Paul more, they say is significant. They seem unable to cope with the idea that God's grace applies to the Gentiles. It's a critical point, these two gentlemen say. Both of them, by the way, disciples, ministers, in addition to university scholars, academic scholars. They urged Bible students to discuss that point and reflect on its historical consequences and how it's played out over history for us. Also, they teach, do not miss that the signs of them throwing the dust and removing their cloak means that they felt they were doing their duty. And these two gentlemen had, and doing their godly duty, their divine duty. They also call special attention to verse 9 there in chapter 23. We find no fault, no wrong with this man. There was the Pharisaic component, or a group of the Pharisees. Make that response. They teach that is the Pharisaic judgment, also implying this probably is not the judgment of the Sadducees. And after all, the Pharisees are in the position of enforcing obedience to Jewish law, Torah law, if you will, while the Sadducees are the ones who rule the temple and have the legal authority under the Roman situation. So that's part of the situation here, is that we have divided leadership. You have theological leadership in the form of the Pharisees, and you have the legal aspect within the Jewish area that's coming down through the high priest and the Sadducees. Some scholars try to make much out of Paul not recognizing Ananias as high priest, but most excuse it that Paul has been away for years. Some evidence maybe 14 years, for some time now. Also, the high priest must not have had his special garments on, for when Paul is informed he is high priest, he immediately reacts appropriately and quotes the scripture showing he knows what to do. But this man, I think, was high priest from somewhere around late 40s, 48, 49, something like that, until the time the Romans sacked that place in 66, and he was executed early on in that. I'm not sure. I think he was assassinated, but don't hold me to that. I'm just not sure how that deal. But he ruled for quite some time, but he didn't take over till like 48 or 49. And much of that previous time, Paul would not have been there. By the way, this kind of, with that man's introduction, it kind of throws this idea in here that also some scholars know we're getting close to the end of the old temple rule in Jerusalem, as he was killed early on when Rome sacked the place. I hope this gives you some idea how scholars look at this long read. Put a few things there in context, and that you have a good Bible study, and we'll catch you on another lesson.